what we saw was a real opportunity to educate the market about how our business model and our governance model, frankly, had just been validated by one of the largest tech companies in the world.
Welcome to Hedera Hashgraph's Gossip About Gossip. I'm Daniel Francis.
I'm Ken Anderson.
And I'm Paul Madsen.
If you are a developer, an entrepreneur, crypto enthusiast, or just trying to learn more about how distributed ledger technology and Hedera Hashgraph will impact your industry, then you'll love the episodes that we have coming up. Bookmark us, add us to your podcast app, and stay tuned.
Hey everyone, Ken Anderson here, and I'm joined today by my co-host Zenobia. How's it going, Zenobia?
Hey Ken, doing well, thanks. How are you?
I am doing great. Thanks for joining me today on this podcast episode where we are joined by a special guest, Mance Harmon, the CEO of Hedera Hashgraph. Mance, thanks for joining us.
Hey everybody, glad to be here.
Excellent. Well, we've had an exciting couple of weeks, but this last week we had kind of a special thing that we did. We posted an ad in the Wall Street Journal. And Zenobia, why don't you go into more depth about where that came from and what we're communicating? What was the context of that?
Sure. Thanks, Ken. So, it's not every week that one of the largest tech companies enters into a space where you have been working hard for a number of years. And so on Tuesday, we saw Facebook Libra's announcement of their cryptocurrency and related aspects of what they were doing in the distributed ledger and crypto space. And as a marketer, this is one of those unique opportunities where you say, gosh, the world has shifted. My cheese has moved. What do we do to leverage this? And I think as we looked at it and we dived into the actual details of the Facebook Libra announcement more, many things in that started to seem very familiar. And so, Mance, from your perspective, what it was like having a conversation with the marketing team after that, and then perhaps we can dive into the content and some of the similarities that we saw.
Yeah, I was having a conversation with Christian Hashgraph, who is, of course, our chief marketing officer, about this. And we both were in total agreement that this was really good news for Hedera for a range of reasons. My immediate reaction, personally, was one of excitement when I saw what was happening with Facebook. I think that it's probably one of the most important events since Bitcoin was introduced a decade ago. And Christian certainly felt the same way. And what we saw was a real opportunity to educate the market about how our business model and our governance model, frankly, had just been validated by one of the largest tech companies in the world. And so I think the event clearly is good for the market as a whole. Just in general, it's going to bring a lot of awareness to people that are outside of sort of the niche cryptocurrency market. And from that perspective, it's going to broaden the potential user base of the technology. And that's good for everybody in the cryptocurrency and distributed ledger technology category in general. But for us in particular, seeing that they took our ideas around governance and some of the ideas around the technology and adopted those as their own was gratifying, frankly, to see it and know that Facebook had to have had it in mind whenever they decided to go the direction that they went.
Yeah, and I think, from a creative process, once we started thinking about this, as a PR person, it's always important to be able to back up the kinds of things that you're doing in the market in other areas, right? In advertising, in other aspects of marketing. And so for those of you who didn't see the ad, it says, "Thank you, Facebook Libra. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery." And then it goes on to say, "Hedera Hashgraph, it's been their internet for too long. Make it yours." So Mance, maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the things that you shared in the blog as well that back up that statement that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. And what were the similarities that you saw between what Facebook had been sharing and what we have been talking about for a number of years now?
Sure. Well, so back in February of last year, 2018, we had our first conversation with Facebook This was when I believe David Marcus had just taken over the project. That was a small group of people. They were just beginning to staff up, and they were just taking a survey of the market. How did the different projects view the market? What were the problems or obstacles to mainstream adoption that were being addressed? Of course, we did talk at length about the technology and the virtues of Hashgraph. And then, as important, and I stress this then, I stress this every time I talk about it, I believe as important is governance. The importance of having the kind of governance model that we have to both address the technical requirements of scaling a cryptocurrency from its inception to broad distribution at a very high value, and sort of relieving the technical trust from the council to the market through that process. And then in addition to sort of the technical requirements of bootstrapping a proof of stake cryptocurrency system in that way using the council, in addition to that, the need to have such a council to instill trust in mainstream markets that will consider using the platform for building applications on top of. And the two combined, so the technical requirements and the need to have mainstream markets trust the organization behind the product roadmap of the platform, and trust that it's going to be a platform that they can depend on for many, many years to come. And, when you go through that logic and you understand it, it makes sense and clearly resonated with Facebook when they decided to create the governance model that they've created.
All right. And Ken, I know you have been getting questions from some of the community. Do you want to dive a little bit deeper into some of those and some of the technical similarities and potentially differences as well?
Well, I'll tell you that when I initially saw the Facebook Libra announcement, I don't know that I had the same aha moment that Mance and Christian had. But very shortly after, when they kind of explained it, the idea that our concepts have been validated, as a developer advocate, my goal is to advocate for the developers. And so I'm always trying to put myself in their shoes. And we always go back to the community and ask, what are your thoughts about this announcement? And I'll tell you, there's lots of projects out there that are doing things that are similar to what we're doing. This is, I think, a good piece of news in that we have one of the largest tech companies validating a decision that we made. But there's one thing in particular that always stands out, even from the developer's perspective, something that's fundamentally different than every other DLT out there. And it's unique to Hashgraph, and that is the asynchronous Byzantine fault tolerance that it brings, or ABFT. I kind of want to talk about that a little bit because there's lots of similarities between other platforms. And I think it's a good perspective and it's a good way to approach it, to recognize it as validation of the decisions we've made. But I think it's still important, and maybe even ABFT is not as well understood as it should be. But that's a pretty huge deal. That's a pretty huge differentiator. And so I'd like to kind of push that at Mance. Mance, if you could address that and tell me what's so special about ABFT? Why is that meaningful to the enterprise space and the general developer space, in the DLT space specifically?
Yeah, well, when we're talking about enterprise applications or mission critical applications, then part of what they care about is knowing that the network is going to continue to operate without interruption. And when we talk about ABFT, asynchronous Byzantine fault tolerance, as opposed to any other form of BFT, PBFT is a consensus algorithm, is not asynchronous. There are timeouts in PBFT, as an example. Raft is a leader-based system that has leaders that are associated with helping to put transactions into an order and taking turns. Any of these other forms of BFT that have some form of coordinator or leader, even if that leader, the role of leader changes on a periodic and frequent basis, or there's some kind of timeouts that are associated with the function of the protocol. Anytime you have any of that, then there is an opportunity for an attacker to attack one or a few nodes and effectively stop the function of the network. And what the asynchronous property means in ABFT is that there's no leader. There are no synchronous processes. There are no timeouts. And because of that, there's no opportunity for an attacker to attack the network in the same way. And that raises the reliability of the network and eliminates, vectors of attack that the other forms of BFT are more susceptible to. And so just the security of the network is improved, generally speaking, because we've eliminated the possibility of categories of attacks that others, maybe they take countermeasures, maybe they put in place mitigation factors for addressing those threats, but they have to try to address the threats. That's the problem. And there's always this back and forth between the attacker and the defender. There's this arms race, if you will, between the two, unless you can eliminate the attack vector entirely. And that's what we've done with ABFT. Now, sort of closely related to the security improvements that are associated with ABFT is this property that we call fairness. And the idea here is that if there are leaders of any form, then there is an opportunity for that leader to influence the order of transactions that the community ultimately agrees upon. And so, right, the whole point of distributed ledger technology is to have a community, a population, come into agreement on the order of transactions, a consensus order of transactions. And all of these algorithms typically have the property that once the community is in consensus, then it can't be changed after the fact, or at least not easily changed after the fact. However, if there is a leader or a coordinator or other, if it's the case that at any point in time, there is the opportunity for a single party to influence what the consensus will be in the future by the community, then it's not fair. That matters in a lot of use cases. For example, if we're talking about a trading platform, a stock market, and there's a matching platform where bids and asks are flowing into the platform, you really don't want a market where at any point in time, one party can delay, even by a little bit, one of those bids, right? And if they can delay a bid or drop the bid or a transaction, whatever it is, then they can unfairly benefit one party to the detriment of another, and that could be consequential. And it's not just trading platforms or markets. This is going to be true in games and in auctions and in time-limited business transactions. There's just a whole range of use cases where this fairness property is really important. And if you don't have the leaders, like we don't, because in part we're ABFT, then you have this property of fairness. The two combined, the asynchronous BFT that provides the additional level of security that raises the bar on the entire industry for security, along with fairness that, again, raises the bar in terms of security and protection against unfair activities on the consensus. Those two combined certainly is unique in the market and is part of the value proposition of Hashgraph.
Yeah, and I think that resonates whenever you talk to a technical person, when we're implementing a lot of these proofs of concepts and these workshops that we're doing. A lot of people are saying, well, why wouldn't I use this DLT or why wouldn't I use that DLT? This one's open source and this one doesn't have a governance council and I can grab this and do whatever I want with it. And then the question always comes back to, cool, so who's going to be the leader in this consortium or in this POC? Because, even if we look at blockchain, it's a matter of selecting the next leader in the current models that exist. And if we look at some of the other DLTs, it's a matter of having validators or some type of controller there. And that becomes a pretty important part of the discussion of who controls that, who has the keys to the kingdom. And if it's two parties that have the keys to the kingdom in an organization or in a POC that has 200 participants, then those 200 participants or the 198 participants are going, well, why do those people get the power? Or what happens if somebody manipulates something there. How does that affect our business model? I'll mention we had a recent proof of concept workshop in the telecommunications space. I was really excited to talk about the fair timestamp aspect of what we were doing. And they basically came back and said, well, we already have synchronized clocks and timestamps not one of our challenges. We already have these entire call control plane networks that operate on these synchronized clocks. So that's not a concern for us. So their question was, so what? So I'm going to put that to you real quick. One of the things we get out of this fairness and the APFT and really what we're trying to accomplish with Hashgraph is we get this fair timestamp, but not every use case is going to make use of that. And some of them are going to say, so what?
Well, that's a fair comment in many cases. In the event that you implicitly trust all of the computers on your network, in other words, if you're a single organization and you're running all of the nodes in the organization and there's no real concern that any one of those nodes is going to be manipulated or modified by an insider threat, or maybe the computer has been hacked and an external party has taken over. If you're not worried about that kind of threat, then fine. Use a consensus clock that you've created, or a synchronized clock that you've created internally, and all of that is fine. However, if it's the case that you do worry about those things, maybe it's the case that you have a computer running in different business units within the organization. Maybe there are third parties or external parties outside of your organization that are running an instance of a node in the network or a computer in the network. Then what you have to worry about is whether any single computer in that network has been compromised. It's not whether you have a good business relationship with those organizations. The business relationships may be very good and you may all trust each other at that sort of business level. The real question is, do you trust the sysadmins for each one of those computers to absolutely guarantee with 100% certainty the security of those computers? And if the answer is no, if you actually do have some concern about their ability to protect those computers from being compromised, then there is an opportunity to take advantage of our technology and distributed ledger technology in general to improve the trust model for the network as a whole. And so it really boils down to understanding what the threat model is and whether you care about the threats that distributed ledger technology protects against. And in our experience, when we phrase it or characterize it in those terms, then in many cases where it didn't seem like the customer really cares about the threat, when they understand what the threat model is that we're protecting against, then they recognize the value of Hashgraph and having a consensus timestamp on the transactions.
Well, and I think that's the case with a lot of these projects. They're looking at other solutions in the DLT space. And I think the answer that I almost invariably come back to is, well, if that's not part of your concern, then why are we looking at DLT at all? Because if any other DLT can do it that's on the market right now, not only can Hedera do it, but Hedera can do it fairly and securely. That's always the question I have. Even as a developer advocate, I sometimes am an adversary. I play devil's advocate sometimes in some of those POC workshops of, well, if that's the case, then why are we using DLT at all? But I'll say I like your point where you're talking about even within an organization where you have multiple business units or multiple server management units. If we think about something even as simple as like Google Cloud Spanner, which is currently I think they're using Raft, a PBFT solution, to avoid race conditions on synchronized database so that when you write, things are written in the order that the network receives it, or at least in the order that Raft determines that it's in. But the Raft model has some security and performance and some other limitations to it, and definitely fairness component, where something like that makes a lot of sense, where even as an internal solution, if I've got synchronized databases and I need to make sure that the writes happen in a fair order and that we avoid race conditions, something like that would be a perfect candidate And we think about multiple interests or multiple parties, but it's even just the security and optimized operation of internal systems can benefit from this as well.
No, I think that's exactly right. Anytime where preserving or reflecting in the consensus order the order in which transactions were actually received by the network, anytime that is important, then fairness really matters. If you don't really care when transactions or preserving the order in which transactions were actually received by the network, if you only care about having a consensus on transactions without respect to when they were actually received, then you don't care about fairness. But a lot of use cases do care about preserving that, the validity of the order in which they were received by the network. And that's where fairness matters the most.
Yeah, and I think that's what's really unique about Hedera is because of this ABFT property, we get that enhanced security. So maybe you don't care about fairness, but you care about security, and it becomes important. Or maybe it's all internal and trust is already established, but maybe it is the fair ordering or the time stamping that is important to you. Maybe you want to perform atomic swaps between two disparate systems. Kind of a global fair timestamp becomes critical at that point because we all have to agree when this atomic swap is going to happen and then perform those functions on either system. All we're doing is leveraging the timestamp itself and none of the other properties, but you get all of those for free with ABFT anyway. So I think the result of this last week's activities, when it came to a few weeks ago with Facebook's announcement and this last week with our ad in the Wall Street Journal, I think about it more now is kind of like those are all validations of some of the business decisions that we've made to add stability and consistency and regulatory compliance to the platform as a whole. But it doesn't change the fact that there's a uniqueness about Hedera in the fact that we have that ABFT property.
No, well, look, I've always said that there are two halves of the company in terms of value proposition, right? That performance is important and security is important. Both of those are addressed with the technology, but we've recognized that that's not enough to build a company that survives 100 years. You also have to address the business concerns or business obstacles. And two of those that are really important are the stability of the network in terms of being able to make a commitment to the market that it's going to be a single network. It's not going to fork, and addressing those concerns by mainstream customers. And then also the governance model. And that was what was validated just now with Facebook.
Absolutely. 100% agree. Thank you again, Mance, for taking time to jump on the podcast with Zenobia and I and answer some of these questions. I know Zenobia had a lot of fun last week in preparation for the ad. I've always got technical questions, but for me, it's always, so what? So when I sit down in the business with the solution architects, what does this all mean to them? And I think you've answered it very well, and thank you for doing so.
Thank you again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for listening to Hedera Hashgraph's Gossip About Gossip. If you liked the episode, please subscribe, rate and review, and also share and tell your friends.
Or connect with us on social media like Twitter, Instagram, etc. at Hashgraph, particularly if you want to leave us feedback on the podcast. We look forward to hearing from you.